This was a cabin vacation nightmare. Sisters survived as paroled criminals killed their family, set fire to their cabin, and kidnapped them, planning to sell them for satanic rituals. With the quick thinking among this entire family and the determination to save these young girls, there were survivors. Before we get into the story, I want to thank our sponsor, Free Cash. Free Cash is an online platform that allows you to make money while playing mobile games. The sign-up is completely free and available all over the world. Whether you just have spare time and want to use it to make money, or whether you need to make some extra money, you can do so by simply playing all different types of mobile games. You'll get several different offers from different apps, and you'll pick the one that you want to download. You'll enable app tracking in order for Free Cash to follow along on your progress, and you'll be rewarded for playing. And if you use in-app purchases to speed up the progress, you'll actually get cash back for that as well. Free Cash has 4.5 stars on Trustpilot and gives you real cash when you're ready to cash out. Free Cash is offering our community $5 and a bonus when you start your first offer. Just click the link in my description or the QR code on the screen. It is available all over the world, so your interface might look a little bit different than mine, but the functionality is the same. Play games and earn money. It was 1990 in Park City, Utah, and the Tiede family planned to stay at their remote cabin for Christmas. They referred to their cabin as Tiede Tranquility. It was a place where they could go and feel so peaceful. This family was Kay and Rolf Tiede, who had 3 children, Trisha, Lene, and Sean. They had adopted Lene and then Sean 3 years later, and then fell pregnant with Trisha, who ended up being only 7 months apart in age from Sean. As they often did, they would go up to this cabin and have a huge family party. So they decided to take Kay's mother, who is Beth Potts, along for the holiday. They all headed up there a few days earlier to get everything set up because family had actually moved to Texas for their home base and would come back to Utah, where Kay was from, to celebrate. Their son, Sean, decided that he did not want to go to the cabin early due to it being too cold there. So he ended up staying with his aunt who lived in Utah, Kay's sister, Claudia. He'd be attending the party when they went a few days later anyhow, so it didn't really matter. He loved his aunt, and his aunt was totally okay with this. Claudia and her husband would get a call from the Summit County Sheriff. Now, since they were babysitting Sean, the sheriff asked if they could come and pick up the 2 girls, Lene and Trisha. Claudia's husband, who was the one who actually answered the phone and spoke to the sheriff, was silent most of the call, just listening, only to tell Claudia and Sean that there had been an accident and they needed to go pick up Sean's sisters. Claudia, her husband, and Sean were supposed to meet the family at the cabin the next day for the family Christmas party, and now they were just headed to pick up these 2 girls, and they had no idea why. Well, at least Claudia and Sean. Her husband didn't want to tell her what had actually occurred. You see, Kay, Rolf, and the 3 kids had arrived in Utah from Texas. They often came back to Utah in the summers and the winters to enjoy seasonal sports with their family, since Kay's family did all still live in Utah. However, they did not fly together. You see, Kay and 17-year-old Sean flew in first, and then later Rolf flew in with 20-year-old Lene and 16-year-old Trisha the next day. The Tiede family always flew separately, and this was to make sure that if anything happened to one of the parents, the other one would still be around to take care of the children. So they would all be staying in Beaver Springs at their Tranquility cabin, and when Rolf and the 2 girls arrived the next day on December 21st, he was told by Kay that there was a strange man that Kay and Claudia had met on the road when they were there. Kay said that Rolf needed to go and get the guns out of his car and that this boy did not belong there. Claudia found this very odd that Kay was saying this because she was always known to be very tough. She never played the victim, didn't allow it in others. Kay was a very strong woman and mother. She usually didn't stop living life long enough to worry about anything. So this was very odd for Kay to be bringing this up to Rolf. And she continued to do so when Rolf was just dismissing her. She said she had a bad feeling about this boy, and she ended up having to beg Rolf to go and get the guns for him to believe what she was saying. Claudia remembered that this boy was there on the side of the road. He was probably in his early 20s. He was tall, he was thin, wearing a light jacket, Levi's, and tennis shoes. When they tried to ask the boy if he needed any help, he refused to answer. So this made Kay very uncomfortable, and that night before Rolf and the girls got there, she actually asked Claudia to stay with her just in case anything were to happen. But Rolf told Kay that he wasn't too bothered about this young boy because he believed he had seen him on his way to the cabin as well. He said that there was a young boy who was stuck in a snowbank with his snowmobile and that he actually helped to pull him out, that he was very kind, that everything was fine. What they didn't know at this time, Rolf and Kay, was that these were two different boys and that they were both trouble. So the next day on December 22nd, the family who were staying at that Tranquility cabin would head out shopping in Salt Lake City. This was a long drive. You couldn't even drive to the actual cabin. You had to ride a snowmobile and then get your car down the path. They had gone to Salt Lake City knowing this was going to be a very long day, but they were going to head back that afternoon. So it was around 1:45 p.m. when Kay, her mother Beth, and her daughter Lene would arrive back at the cabin. Now, Rolf and Trisha were actually picking up a snowmobile, and so they would be home around an hour later. But around 3 in the afternoon that day, a 911 call would be made by Rolf's brother, who was headed to that cabin for the family party. His name was Randy, but due to this being a remote cabin, the service was very spotty, so he couldn't connect with the dispatcher long enough to fully tell them the story of what happened, so he simply got out that they needed help. Because as he had driven up that 2-mile driveway in his snowmobile headed to his brother, he saw another snowmobile coming towards him. He realized that the man who was swollen and covered in blood was his brother. Rolf could barely speak, he was barely conscious, but he was able to get out the words, "Save my girls." That's exactly what Randy planned to do. He had no idea the situation at hand, but he threw Rolf in the back of his snowmobile and he headed to the nearest store gas station to use their payphone to call 911. He was then able to inform 911 of exactly what was happening, that his brother needed immediate medical help, and so a helicopter arrived only minutes later, and locals from every police station around this area were dispatched. You see, crime did not happen around here. So the fact that Randy had told them that there was a murder and kidnapping that just occurred, this made everyone on edge, and so everybody was out looking for these two kidnapped girls and the assailants. As the search was on, Rolf was airlifted to a hospital. Randy went out searching for his nieces, and the girls had no idea that anyone was coming to help them at all, or that their dad was still alive. You see, nobody knew the extent of what had happened at that cabin. They had bits and pieces. They knew Rolf was in a terrible condition. They knew these girls had been taken hostage, but they had not known what they had gone through. So the Tiede family's car, which was a Lincoln Town car, had an APB sent out, and all of the police departments were out searching for this. Now, the Summit County Sheriff ended up locating the vehicle and began to pursue it. And finally, the car would come to a stop after speeding, swerving, rolling backwards, almost off a cliff, and stopping at the bottom of the hill, miraculously not rolling over. Now, there was a standoff at this point. Shots rang out. But soon enough, the girls were rescued and the killers were apprehended. The police had no idea what they were about to face in their investigation, but Lene would confess that when they arrived at this cabin when she was with her mother and her grandmother, it was around 2 p.m. and she had actually seen someone, she thought, in the window of the master bedroom, but they quickly disappeared. She didn't say anything because she actually thought it was her cousin David who was trying to surprise them. So she was actually the first in the cabin that day. She was telling her mom her hands were really cold. She wanted to go put them underwater, so her mom let her in before anyone else, and Lene said she would come back out to help them with all of the shopping bags. She would go happily upstairs trying to surprise her cousin that was trying to surprise her, only to be met by a man wearing her dad's sweatshirt, pointing a gun at her. This man asked her who was downstairs in the car. Lene told him her mother and her grandmother, and he demanded that she call them up there. She did what she was told with his gun pointed at her, and after Kay helped her mother, who was disabled, up the stairs, not knowing what awaited them, they were held at gunpoint as well. They were all told to sit down by this man and another man who had also shown himself as well, but Kay refused. She was one who was very, very strong, like Claudia, her sister, had said, but she was also one not to be told what to do. And Lene would say that the men were taking everything that they wanted. Kay was telling them, you can have anything. I have jewelry, I have money. They were shoving things in their pockets, but then they began shooting, even while getting all of this stuff. Kay was hit 3 times, and her mother, Beth, stood up to help her daughter, but she was also shot 3 times. Grandma Beth fell to the floor beside Kay, and Lene had to watch the entire thing. One of these men looked down at Beth, the grandma, and said, "This bee won't die." He then shot her in the head twice. Lene began praying, and one of the men told her that he didn't believe in God, and he worshipped Satan, so that wasn't going to help. Lene was then drugged to a bedroom and she began to scream, so a dirty sock was shoved in her mouth and duct tape was placed over it. Her hands and her feet were bound and she began to choke on this sock in her mouth. And so one of the men took it out and then put it right back in. He then put a knife to her throat and told her that he was as good with a knife as he was with a gun. He also began to tell Lene that he had killed a man in New York in a drug deal, but then nothing was going to happen to her. But Lene was only thinking about the fact that her sister, Trisha, and her father, Rolf, were going to be at the cabin at any moment. And she was worried that they would immediately be killed as well. So she began to think of an escape plan. She knew where the keys were to the family car that, like I said, they couldn't actually use to get up to the cabin, but she could find her way down to the car. And she believed maybe she could get away. At this moment, Trisha would say that she had this gut feeling. She was with her father at a repair shop for the snowmobile, but she had this horrible feeling and she told her dad something was wrong at the cabin. Rolf called the cabin, but no one answered. The line was dead. So that is when they began to make their way there. And then around 2:45 p.m., Rolf and Trisha arrived. Lene was immediately taken outside with a knife to her throat. And Trisha would say as soon as they parked the snowmobile, a man jumped out of the garage wearing a ski mask and demanded that they go inside. When Rolf saw Lene could see it in his eyes that he knew something had happened to his wife and his mother-in-law. The men then asked Rolf if he had any money, and he gave them all that he had. But the man holding Lene at knife point instructed the other to shoot Rolf. But this man refused, and so the man then giving the instructions did it himself. But the first 2 didn't fire. The third one, however, did hit. Rolf was shot in the face and fell to the ground, and Trisha, who was standing next to him, began screaming, jumping up and down, crying. Trisha and Lene were then held outside by one man while the other went inside with gasoline and Rolf. Lene didn't think that the trauma was ever going to stop at this point. They watched as gas was poured all over their family cabin before Rolf was shot in the head once again. This man then lit a match and set the cabin on fire. The girls watched as this man then jumped out of the home. Trisha and Lene were then forced to get on snowmobiles and drive these men down to the family car. You see, there was a gate between the cabin and the car, and they knew how to get past that gate. So they were being drug along to be able to put this code in. But this was around 2 miles to go down the driveway. So the traumatized sisters did what they were told after watching their mother, father, and grandmother be shot to death and their family cabin erupt in flames. Little did they know, though, as they sped down this driveway, that their Uncle Randy, Rolf's brother, was waiting at the gate. You see, he had plans to go snowmobiling with Rolf that day, but as soon as the girls saw him, they knew that this wasn't a good thing. As they opened the gate, Randy began to talk to them, and they ignored him as though they had no idea who he was. When the men asked the girls who he was, Lene quickly told them that they didn't know him, that he must think they were somebody else. Lene knew that if these men knew that Randy was in their family, he would be killed instantly. So as they rode along, Trisha was coming up with this plan on how to wreck the snowmobile, how to get this man off, how to injure this man, but she knew she couldn't leave her sister. Then the girls would come to the car and they would be told to get inside. Trisha was to sit in the passenger seat and Lene was next to the man in the back. They were kept away from the doors. Soon enough, the high-speed chase began, and suddenly they were falling off an embankment as the car came to a stop. And then the girls looked up and saw dozens of cops pointing guns at them. Trisha was thrilled that they were there, but then she realized that these cops didn't know the full story and did not know not to shoot at them. So she told Lene to duck. They grabbed hands. They went down into the car, and that is when a gunshot actually rang out, and it ended up being an officer who had shot at one of the men who had pointed a gun at him. However, his gunshot had pierced this car inches from Lene's head. As these two men were arrested, Lene told the cops to kill them, that they had just killed their mother, their father, and their Grams. Uncle Randy, though, would be telling investigators at this point that he knew something was strange the moment that he saw his nieces driving down in the snowmobiles. He said that he saw them with boys who he thought maybe they had boyfriends that they had over, but when he saw their faces and they didn't respond to him, he knew something was up. And so as he drove to that gate to meet with Rolf, he found Rolf and realized what was happening. After Rolf was transported to the hospital in critical condition, it was found that it was a miracle that he was still conscious. He had one bullet through the side of his skull, and another bullet had misfired but had hit him in the face, not penetrating. He was also covered in gas and had burns all over his body. And once he was stable, Rolf would say that once he knew that these men had set the cabin on fire and taken his girls, he actually gathered the strength to get up, put out the fire with his bare hands, but then he realized that he was covered in gasoline. He wasn't helping, so he ran, he got in the shower, hosed himself off, he got in dry clothes, and then without even putting a jacket on and freezing cold weather, he ran outside with 2 bullet wounds in his head, burns all over his body, to save his daughters. And he succeeded. The 2 men were identified as Vaughn Lester Taylor, who was a 25-year-old, and 21-year-old Edward Stephen Deli. Both had a criminal record, Vaughn for aggravated burglary and Edward for arson. They had been staying in a halfway house prior to this because they had both been paroled. That is where they met, and they were allowed to go looking for jobs. However, during one of these days where they were supposed to come back, they disappeared. And that is when they would admit to hitchhiking to Oakley, which was near Beaver Springs, which is where Vaughn's family had a cabin. They said, though, that they broke into multiple different cabins that were empty at the time. They were on the mountain for several days. So investigators were theorizing that these men broke into the Tranquility cabin on December 22nd, when the family had left, and they waited for them to return after seeing all their Christmas decorations up and knowing that someone was there at that time. It was found that these men took a shower in the home, they ate food from the pantry, and they slept in the beds while waiting to harm the owners. You see, after the arrest, investigators rushed to this cabin hoping to rescue anyone who had survived. Instead, they found a 12 to 18 inch puddle of blood frozen in the garage, as well as a bloody shoe print. And they also noticed what smelled like burning hair and clothing and realized that the upstairs was still on fire. The stairs had blood smears on all of the walls, and the living room carpet was drenched with blood that actually bled through to the wood below. Blood drips in this home had turned to blood icicles. The bloody drag marks had led the investigators to the deck where they would find Kay and Beth in a blanket covered in snow. They were deceased upon arrival, but the officers said that this looked like a mini war zone. But they would also find the Tiede family video camera at this home, and it had a tape in it, which investigators thought was probably just of family memories. However, when they watched this tape, they realized that the killers had actually recorded themselves opening packages that this family had wrapped and left under the tree for Christmas in a few days. They had opened them on camera. Edward was filming while Vaughn ripped open the presents. Vaughn opened one that happened to be a photo album, and he immediately honed in on one of the girls. And he said, Lene.
I don't know. Okay. I don't think I got all of this. don't know.
Find out.
How am I supposed to find out?
The instructions. And Lene. Come on, Pat. Oh, wow.
What is it?
Baseball card.
Okay. Let's see a couple of them.
Oh, the football and basketball. And
Show them this way. Turn them this way. Okay. Next page.
Edward Deli would tell police during interrogations that after they killed Kay and Beth and had to clean up the mess, he was sick. He said that there was blood everywhere, brain matter on the floor, and he went to the bathroom to throw up. He said that he took Lene to the bedroom simply to calm her so she didn't have to see the blood. Vaughn was claiming during his interrogation that he was not sure if he fired the shots or not. He then began to say that he had to shoot Kay because she wouldn't sit down when he told her to. He said he didn't know why the screaming daughter was kept alive, that she was a nice girl, an attractive girl, and that he had sympathy for her, but he didn't know why they didn't kill her. Both refused to give many details or rat each other out or really give a concrete story on who was the actual shooter. Investigators, though, found that inside the cabin around 10 a.m., the phone had been used to call the halfway house that these two men had come from. These two criminals had told their roommate there, a man named Scott Manley, that they were at the cabin and they were going to waste the husband, wife, and son. They had seen a picture of the whole family and had seen Sean in the photo. However, of course, Sean was not actually there. They said that they then planned to steal their car and take their girls to New York City to sell them to satanic worshippers for their use in satanic rituals. But on December 24th of 1990, Edward and Vaughn were charged with 2 counts of criminal homicide in the first degree, 1 count of attempted criminal homicide in the first degree, aggravated arson, 2 counts of aggravated kidnapping, aggravated robbery, theft, failure to respond to an officer's signal to stop, and aggravated assault. Lene and Tricia would then be told that their father had survived. He was their hero. He was the reason they had gotten help so quickly. But their mother and their grandmother had been taken from them. But Lene and Tricia, they didn't feel as though one of these men was more responsible than the other for these deaths. They wanted both to get the death penalty. 49-year-old Kay had passed away that day, with her family saying that she was one of the most devoted mothers that they had ever known. She would have given up anything for her children, including her life. That she was strong-willed and that she raised strong-willed children as well. Her mother, 76-year-old Beth, had passed away that day as well, and she was said to be full of life, full of energy. Even at her age, she was fun and she was happy. Their autopsies found that the fatal wound for Kay was consistent with a .44 caliber gun. Beth had a .44 caliber wound to her head and a .38 caliber wound to her chest, both possibly being fatal. They had a joint funeral, and Kay's sister Claudia, Trish, Lene, and Sean's aunt really stepped up to help these kids and take on the motherly role, especially when Rolf was still in the hospital getting help. Claudia believed, though, that Vaughn Taylor was the mastermind and Edward Deli was just the partner. You see, Edward Deli was found to be in foster care growing up, and when his foster mother learned of the murders 2 months later, she announced that she wished that he had killed her instead of those innocent people. As Vaughn and Edward arrived in the courtroom to hear their charges, they were together and they began to laugh and grin at each other. This would be the last time that their cases would be together. They would then be separated. But on May 1st of 1991, 5 months since the murders, Vaughn, believed to be the mastermind by some, took a plea deal for 2 counts of capital murder. In exchange, the state dropped all other charges against him, and during his sentencing trial, his attorney told the jury that Vaughn thought his own crimes were gross and vile, and that criminals did not think like them, as in the jury. Now, a psychiatrist named Dr. Monich claimed that Vaughn had confessed to being the shooter and killing both victims to him. That he took that .38 caliber and he emptied it into the victims, and he grabbed the .44 caliber and he emptied that into the victims as well. Lene testified that she heard Vaughn say that he had to shoot the bee in the head twice, meaning her grandmother. Vaughn testified, though, that he did not remember much. He remembered pointing the gun but not shooting it, saying that it happened so quick he didn't really know. But he was also very argumentative on the stand, and he ended up being sentenced to death. Lene would say he was an evil man. There was no remorse, and you could see it in his eyes. Edward Deli, on the other hand, opted for trial. His defense claimed that he didn't do any of the shooting. Lene and Trisha, they planned to testify. Officer Joe Offert had spoken to them throughout this entire investigation and believed that they were excellent witnesses. They were very sure about all the details. Their statements were both the exact same. They were very articulate, and they talked about everything in a very unemotional way. Possibly because they were traumatized. But Lene would move toward the stand and immediately stare forward at nothing, as though no one was there. But she was answering these questions even though she was extremely pale and disassociated. Both girls were asked to use the real murder weapons and show the court what Edward had done, meaning that they had to actually touch the murder weapons that killed their family. They did so, but neither felt that this was appropriate afterwards. But as Edward proceeded with his trial, the shock was abundant on his face as Rolf walked into the courtroom to testify himself. He had survived his injuries, and Edward had no idea. His face was described as defeated. Rolf then testified against him. On May 14, 1991, Edward Deli was found guilty of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison. The Tiede family didn't actually agree with this verdict, but it was due to one jury member deciding to hold out against first-degree murder, and they didn't want this to be another whole trial that the family had to go through, so they settled for second degree. Trisha has said that she often cries in silence, hiding her pain, her anger, her frustration. Lene said that she went through trying to find happiness in areas where happiness doesn't exist. She feared that anyone she loved would abandon her. In July 1994, Vaughn, who was on death row, then appealed. He fired his attorney. He claimed inadequate representation at trial, and he stated that his attorney misinformed him about the effect of a guilty plea, which led him to plead guilty, and he would have not otherwise done so. He also said that they had failed to conduct an adequate investigation of his psychological history and condition. Now, his psychological evaluation showed signs of antisocial personality disorder and schizoid personality features. His childhood involved a facial scar he had got, a learning disorder, and substance abuse in the family. And his later life involved drug abuse, involvement with Satanism, and witchcraft, including drinking animal blood. But none of this was even mentioned at his sentencing trial. But due to this, since he appealed, there was a Rule 23B of the Utah Rules of Appellate Procedure, and they would find that the prosecution presented overwhelming evidence against Vaughn. That Lene had witnessed the murders. Trisha and Lene had witnessed the attempted murder and the aggravated kidnapping, and the police officer that apprehended him had seen that he tried to flee with hostages. It was then found that Vaughn really pled guilty because he didn't want to put his family and the victim's family through trial, and he also didn't want to testify against Edward. His counsel was ruled effective, and the case went back to the Utah Supreme Court. In October 24, 1997, his conviction and sentence was upheld. But in 2001, Lene actually received a letter from Edward Deli. He claimed that he had grown into a man and that he was not that same evil boy who had committed the crime. Now, it did take Lene 9 years to respond, and she chose to forgive for herself, but not forget. She said she finally felt free after that. And these sisters and their father, they actually rebuilt the cabin that these men had tried to destroy even better than before. Their dad, Rolf, often said that lightning doesn't strike in the same location twice. And he was always telling Lene that everything was going to be okay, that she was safe. The cabin is now looked at as the family as a place for healing. They bring family and friends, and they're determined not to let these men take away more of the things that they love. They took their mom and their grams, and that's where it ends. Lene got married to her high school sweetheart, and together they have a blended family of 9 children. Trisha is a single mother of 2 girls, and for a long time she went through periods of anger and frustration, not understanding why this happened to them. But now she said she looks into her daughter's eyes and she sees her mother and her father. The father, survivor Rolf, he ended up passing in 2008, family by his side, but he helped those girls heal in so many ways after what had happened to them. Claudia has said that her sister Kay would be so delighted to hear that Lene and Trisha have healed through what they have gone through and what they've done with their lives since. But this affected the entire community. Interestingly enough, the mayor at the time of the murders was a man named Ken, and he and his brother Dutch both owned a corner store and a gas station in the area. And it turned out that December before the murders, Dutch had given a ride unknowingly to one of the murderers after he had walked down to the store for help. The man told him girls had picked him up and took him to a cabin and they were having mechanical problems with their car, and so Dutch, who was a mechanic, offered to help and drove him back. And after these killers were caught, Dutch realized that he was sitting next to a murderer and he could have been a victim himself, and now he has vowed not to ever speak to a stranger again. Vaughn Taylor has filed several appeals throughout the years for his death row sentence, his 5th being in 2023. He now claims that Edward was the one that killed both Kay and Beth and cites a new ballistic analysis. A federal judge then held a hearing to hear this new evidence and then concluded that the women had been killed by a .44 Magnum carried by Edward, not Vaughn. However, a year later, his death sentence was reinstated because Utah law doesn't distinguish between the murderer and the accomplice, and Vaughn pled guilty to murder in general. This was a family of fighters, strong people who cared so much about each other. Even Kay's mother, who was in her 70s, got up to help her daughter when she was shot, risked her own life to see if she could help her daughter in any way. And then Kay's daughters were trying to help and ended up saving their uncle's life by not saying he was there. And then their own father, who was in such critical condition, knew that he had to get out of that house. He had to survive so those girls could survive. It's just an entire family of incredible warriors. Survivor stories will always have a special place in my heart. If you don't know, I have a playlist of them down below. If you would like to check them out, make sure you are subscribed with that post notification bell on. Make sure in your settings, YouTube will allow notifications so you can actually get a notification as soon as my video is posted. I also have a vlog channel if you want to check that out down below and see my life in a whole different state, 1,000 miles away from my family. So don't forget to speak up. Your voice is powerful enough and I love you to absolute pieces. Okay?